Well, morning, everybody. Firstly, I'd like to just introduce myself. My name's Lee Phillips. I'm the Managing Director of ISG. And I only can just say a few words, but before I go into that, I just wanted to thank BT, Paul, for hosting this event for us. It's very kind of you, Paul. Thank you. And also a big thanks to the panel that's joined us here this morning to debate our thought leadership session around low carbon retrofit. It's a certain internal unit that we've understood the importance in the industry, and I find as I go around the industry and certainly from politics and government, there's lots of talk around what we should be doing and maybe when we should be doing it. But we're still finding our own feet in doing a lot of talking and maybe not so much doing. So certainly from an ISG perspective, it's all about sharing best practice and learning as we go. So we decided to launch our low carbon retrofit business unit as part of UK Fit Out in September just gone, which is headed by Mike and Paul here at the front. So I think all of the lessons that we have learned across all of the industry, but it's how do we put this into practice? And certainly with government legislation changing and how we roll that out and repurpose buildings and make them more sustainable and decarbonised in terms of our approach is probably one of the biggest things. So part of our ESG policy of ISG and the statutory board is part of the strategy, how we take our business into the future. Because what we've been doing, our fit out business has been around for some 30 years now. Those of you old enough to remember Interior PLC, I do. And how things have evolved in different sectors that we work in through retail, our mega projects that we do, our construction business, our engineering business, our data centre. We touch pretty much everything across the £2.4 billion revenue in 23 countries. So I guess this room today is about maybe just learning from each other. We've got an amazing panel here. There's going to be some really interesting questions, I'm sure. I'd love to stay with you for the whole session. And just to share with you as well, if it's okay, we are filming this session and we'll circulate that on relevant networks and to all of you after this session. But I'm going to hand over to Anna, and thanks everyone for coming. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Lee. Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Foden. I'm head of sustainability at ISG. So thank you for coming, panelists. I'll introduce you in a sec. So we all have a role to play here as we try to reach our ambitious targets and really build sustainable societies. So we're faced with a period of economic downturn and disruption that could potentially threaten to hamper our progress. So our obligation to deliver on our commitments and protect our communities has never been more vital. We can see the goal. We know that radical change is required, and now is the time to act and move from theorizing to delivery. So with many misconceptions circulating that could stand to oppose this progress, we're bringing together leaders in the industry that are paving the way to accelerate change on the retrofit agenda. So I'm just going to introduce everyone. Matt is the director of the CIBSE Low Carbon, is a director and a CIBSE Low Carbon consultant at Twin & Earth, Matt Cotton. We've got James Hepburn, principal at BDP. We've got Hugh Dugdale, who's the associate director at Elementa. We've got our own Peter Kelly, who's the group director of sustainable operations at ISG. And we've got Ben Humphreys, who's a director at Archetype. So I'm going to kick things off here with Peter. A question for you. What are some of the key blockers that we've all faced or heard to be rumored? We know cost and program are always essential operational drivers, but we've now seen have we seen proof of concepts that these can be overcome whilst delivering on the low carbon retrofit agenda?
Thanks, Anna, and morning, everybody. Thank you for coming this morning. Really looking forward to this session. That's a great question. Three of us on this panel have just finished a very in-depth green retrofit. So James, Ben and I worked very closely together on the Utopia building for the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership. And for that, when you talk about cost and programme, I think the really important thing here was that the sustainability credentials were baked in from day one, literally from concept design all the way through to handing over and beyond into post-occupancy. So that meant that no compromises were made on those very challenging requirements, which were BREEAM Outstanding, WELL Gold, the ENIFIT retrofit standard, which is for passive house, embodied carbon targets, and also circular economy targets. So once they were all baked in and the client wouldn't compromise on any of those requirements, it meant that everybody worked together to make the program and the costs work. And there are some studies going on at the minute with G&T and 3PM, the project managers, and ourselves in order to show the costs of that retrofit. We're pretty confident that they'll come out as neutral compared to standard retrofits. Obviously, unfortunately, we had the impacts of Brexit at the time with material sourcing and also COVID. So once we strip those two factors out, we really feel we'll be able to show that you can do very low carbon retrofit at the same cost as a standard retrofit. So the key point here is to really bake it in from the start. Don't compromise on those very low carbon retrofit standards. And that should mean that you can bake it into the process as you go and don't compromise.
Great, thank you, Peter. James and Ben, I think you guys both worked across that project. If you wanted to elaborate on any of Peter's points there.
Yeah, yeah, it was an amazing project to be part of, and I'd second everything that Peter said. I think there's another component to it as well, which is really understanding what you've got in front of you and understanding the building, understanding the fabric, how moisture moves through the fabric. This was a building in a conservation area. We were doing an internal insulation strategy, so we really had to understand how that would work in practice, where the dew points were, etc. So a lot of modelling went on, but coupled with that, you have to do quite a lot of surveying as well and really interrogate the building, whether it's brick porosity testing or U-value testing, understanding the fabric and the interventions in the fabric. Unfortunately, on that project, not enough of that happened when it should have done, which was in the design stage. It was left to the contractor to do that later on. And obviously, that meant that when we unearthed it, there were some differences. So we had to be nimble, we had to work collaboratively. I think collaborations are, really, really critical in delivering success in these projects. But we had to be nimble and kind of remodel and actually rework some of the inside to outside wall constructions to make it happen. But I think if we'd had that surveying from the beginning, which is something we collectively all pushed the client to do, but they didn't, it would have been probably a smoother and probably more cost-effective process as well.
I think the other thing to be said is that was a client that really wanted it, and I think that's the challenge. If you've got a client that really wants it and you've got all those difficult things ahead of you, then you can sort of navigate your way through it. If you're trying to convince a client to do a sort of low carbon retrofit as opposed to build something new and shiny, it's more challenging because you say, we've got all these risks, we can take those risks away, we can knock it down, we can build you something new and shiny. That's the real challenge I think we've got. Too many clients don't want to take that risk on, don't see the benefit, and it's trying to help the client get through that and sort of work that journey through.
Great. Let's move on here then, yeah? So I'm going to pass this one. James, keep your mic here. We know that the new incoming base legislation looks to create standards around EPCs. And we know that there's an optimism around legislation right now, but we also know that EPCs probably aren't the silver bullet. So once a building is upgraded to be more efficient, how do we ensure it's maintained and monitored to perform to these standards?
Yeah, I think that there's lots of things there. I mean, EPCs, I think everyone's recognised that EPC is it's a sort of standard that sets allow you to compare other things and set a certain standard, but it doesn't really look at operational energy, and it's probably not even, it doesn't really necessarily reflect how good a building really could perform. I think there's been lots of challenges over the last couple of years in terms of how buildings are operating, so the way they used to operate will change. And I think the other thing in terms of operation, and you may have an EPC A-rated building, how it operates is challenging. How you hand that building over can be really difficult. You can set a building up to operate efficiently on day one. How it then is used and changed, and its use changes, will mean the building operates maybe less efficiently, and that's where your post-occupancy evaluation and your sort of seasonal commissioning comes in, and that has to go on for at least 2 years. And I think because of the way buildings are being used and operated is changing at the moment, that period actually probably needs to be extended at the moment, because we're all sort of learning a new ways of working, and the way things are being operated and the way buildings are being occupied, that's changes as well. So there's sort of lots of flux, and change makes that very difficult.
Yeah, I was going to ask Matt to chime in perhaps about some.
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, kind of, as James says, EPCs aren't the kind of that they set a kind of good direction. But what we've seen is kind of a big kind of focus over the past few years on in-use performance. So the kind of particularly kind of around things like energy use intensity, kind of like setting targets for buildings. And really things like kind of Neighbours UK are kind of really kind of driving kind of the idea that we need to be kind of reducing energy consumption in buildings. But what that's kind of led to is kind of we're finding is kind of more of a focus on actually how buildings are set up. Kind of again, kind of referring back to James's point, we're getting kind of heavily involved in doing kind of detailed modelling, kind of at the early kind of stage of designs, which is influencing the size of plant, the flow temperatures of kind of kit, and that kind of leads to kind of issues around actually kind of getting the right people actually kind of, I know there's perhaps another kind of question on this, but actually kind of there's a big kind of shift that we need to make in terms of our kind of skill and knowledge around actually how to design kind of systems to run kind of correctly. One of the other issues we found actually in terms of in-use performance is kind of sub-metering and the way that sub-meters are set up. We've been in numerous buildings, and actually they may have very kind of good BREEAM ratings, and they've got all the sub-metering that kind of BREEAM kind of requires, kind of different tenancy kind of sub-metering, kind of floor by floor. The problem is it kind of doesn't always kind of communicate well back to the kind of the BMS energy management system. The guys who are interrogating the data maybe haven't got the kind of skill and knowledge to understand actually kind of what they're actually looking at on the screen. The tenants aren't kind of engaged. So there's a whole kind of piece that we need to do the one thing is putting in the kit, the other thing is making sure the data is actually used to drive kind of energy use intensity kind of downwards.
I think just to kind of echo that, again, the energy use intensity is a great metric because you can't cheat it. It's not got factors that apply to it. It's just purely the energy you've used against the floor area of your building. This is a really good thing to be able to apply across the industry. And then it's this tracking process of looking at that over the life of the building continuously, because you need that engaged client that understands the metering they have. And we've had schemes where you can hand it over and you've got reasonable performance in the first year, but if you've got a really applied maintenance team, they can drive that performance down by 40% just by that continual refinement and understanding how they can tweak the system to work better. So it's never a fit and forget problem, and that's why we've got the performance gap we've got at the moment between the design analytics of where buildings should be and where they actually perform. So we need to stay much closer to buildings through their whole lifespan to really see the improvements in energy performance.
You wouldn't invite me on that panel without mentioning Passive House video, but we've been doing Passive House projects since about 2011, or just 2010 and 2011, and we've been monitoring them since. And what we're finding is that the PHPP spreadsheet works incredibly well for predicting energy use in actual use. And then post-occupancy monitoring those, so some of the projects we finished around 2011, we've been monitoring those ever since, and generally it performs as the predictions within the PHPP spreadsheet. What I would say is that POE is incredibly important to not only to optimise the building for the users, but to learn, in the next projects going forward. But we also find that actually a more full soft landings approach right from inception really helps engage the users to understand their building as well, so that they know how to optimize it, they know how the FM works, they know how the control strategy, but also that you work with them to actually design the control strategy so that it's really bedded in with the users, so that everything, when they take occupation of the building, is second nature, but then you work with them post-occupancy to really kind of carry that home and optimize the energy use and comfort as well.
Can someone maybe elaborate on the importance of knowing how occupants use their building before they go into the design stage. Does anyone have any experience with doing that type of monitoring and understanding?
I guess we did a headquarters building for a county council about five years ago, probably. One of the things they were really keen is to have it open 24/7 and 7 days a week. And it was a local council, and we were saying, "You really sure you want to do this?" So we did some modelling very early on where we said, right, okay, if you want to open the whole building up for the 10 people that might want to come in on a Saturday morning, this is probably how much energy you're going to use. If you then say, well, actually, those 10 people need to sit in this location, and that's the bit of the building you'll open up on a Saturday morning when they want to come in, that's how much energy you can save. They then sort of got it. They understood. Oh, well, okay, yeah, we've got to think how we operate the building, how we use the building, and it can start to feed into design. I mean, demand control is absolutely essential. Particularly, we were talking earlier. People are in. There's a lot of Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday people. Mondays and Fridays become quite quiet. If you're not putting demand control into your building that's intelligent and responds to that, then the whole building's operating completely unnecessarily. So there's lots of things like that. And I think it's really difficult to ask a client how you're going to operate their building. Ben talks about PHPP, and it's brilliant, but it's all about, and we've mentioned the sort of any type of TM54 modelling. It's all about those inputs and understanding how the building is going to be occupied. And some clients just don't know. And if you'd have asked someone 3 years ago, it would be very different. You get a very different answer now. So you've got to make sure the design is flexible and can cope with that sort of variation.
Right. Hugh, I'm going to bring this back to you. We had kind of mentioned this actually with the previous question when we chatted yesterday, but we didn't get to it. Are we ready to switch to electrification?
Very interesting topic. Yes, I think we are. But there is some big challenges out there for the infrastructure side of things. In central London, where you've got offices that already have comfort cooling and that side of things, actually we're in a better position because your incoming power supply is sized sufficient for the cooling, which can easily handle the heat pump for heating. Slightly conversely, it's harder to decarbonise some of the low energy buildings that don't have comfort cooling and only have gas boilers, because then you're into the issue of upgrading that electrical supply. And that's where we're seeing projects come into real problems with UKPN responsiveness, UKPN variable costs, and so that is a big thing to get on very early in the project to understand where you need to be with that, and it can be factored in. It's also making sure you look at the building holistically, so you can't just switch from a gas boiler to a heat pump and think that's the solution, although it would be great for your energy performance. Your electricity usage is going to go through the roof, so you need to cut back on your electricity usage elsewhere so you can try and keep the peak loads as close to similar as you can. But it is achievable, and we have achieved it on sites. There is also the slight problem with the historical systems of CHP, where you get the dummy whammy of coming off gas and having to replace the electricity that the CHP is currently providing. So where you've got big installations of that, there is a real problem that needs a bit more longer term planning.
Peter, back to you. Just kind of on that, what do you think can be said about some of the priorities and the trade-offs that clients are kind of really forced to make, I guess from the contractor's point of view?
Well, I think there's always compromises in any project, and you come into a retrofit with a very similar mindset, really. At the Entopia building and other projects we've done, it's largely been around the finishes and fittings as opposed to the actual retrofit itself of the internal insulation, the insulation in the basement, insulation in the roof, etc. has been needed to meet that ENIFIT requirements. So the finishes and fittings have been more looked at, but more from an embodied carbon perspective than a cost or program perspective. So you do have to compromise, but in our experience, it tends to be in the fit outside as opposed to the elements of the retrofit that are really required to reach that low carbon ability, M&E systems, etc.
Right, so we're going to move on here. So we can't make a difference. The problem's too big. Where to start can all be daunting prospects, and we hear that a lot from our clients. So when we look at who's responsible, the truth is we all have a role to play, and we have to reimagine our future and our roles and responsibilities in this new world. So do we feel we have the skills and behaviors in place to work collaboratively across the building's life cycle? So from inception, long past occupancy, as we mentioned. So have we found requirements for new roles emerging? Do existing roles need to be upskilled? How do we better align between ourselves and our partners on these projects? So I'm going to kick this off with Hugh.
Thanks. I think there's a few parts where we do need to upskill. I think we've already touched on building maintenance, understanding the use of the building and the metering and everything like that. So it's that integration of the term smart buildings is banded around a lot. It means different things to different clients, but it's trying to keep that simplistic enough that we can educate the facilities team to utilise it and actually make benefit from it. I think overlapping into that becomes the circular economy that's been touched on already. Understanding that parts might not be bought, but they might be rented, like lighting or things like that, which changes the dynamic of how you maintain it and how you treat that asset. And I think the other subject that's been touched on as well is embodied carbon. And certainly from an MEP perspective, we're playing catch up behind the structures and the facades people who have a good understanding of that. MEP is quite a long way behind, so we're working hard now and we're working with CIBSI and other people to try and bring that forward. But it is becoming a much bigger focus when we're starting to look at whole life carbon over the lifespan of the building and not just that operational carbon, which we have a very good understanding of now.
Yeah.
I think from the contractor perspective, there's definitely a need to upskill our supply chain and work very closely with them, particularly in some of the techniques that we may need around internal installation. Some of the techniques that we employed at the Entopia building, we had to find very specialist contractors to deliver. And the great thing was they were willing to work with our standard supply chain to upskill them so they could then take on those techniques and deliver them on the next project. So we're really good at working with our supply chain, and they're brilliant apprentices, graduates, etc. But I think the type of what we do going forward in terms of those apprenticeships needs to change slightly, and we need to work with those bodies that do the training. We need to work with our supply chain to really educate them about some of those techniques and installation techniques that we're really going to need if we're going to push the envelope in literally in terms of retrofit.
And from the design perspective, architectural perspective, absolutely we have to improve training of our industry to move just away from aesthetics to understanding building physics in particular, and that is incredibly pertinent with existing buildings as opposed to new buildings. So when you've got an existing wall or kind of roof or floor, and really understanding how, if you put internal wall insulation or extra cavity insulation, how is that going to affect, so you don't leave a legacy of condensation or internal kind of problems. So we've been very kind of active in the space, putting our team on through training, whether that's kind of PHPP or WFI or kind of therm, cold bridge analysis, that kind of stuff. And it's also really refreshing to see we're seeing candidates coming forward now with these kind of skills as well. People recognizing I can't just design kind of pretty kind of window elevations or something. I now need to know how they really perform and how they're going to influence kind of the internal environment. And you're getting schools of architecture as well, like University of Bath, who are now sending their students on the Passive House course as part of their training, which is just fantastic. So I think that needs to kind of permeate the industry a bit more, and I think it will, because there's no doubt you just can't do a deep low carbon retrofit without properly understanding what you've got in front of you.
Yeah, Matt, I have a good point from you. Why is it that most people know what a good miles per gallon is for a car, kind of stats for a car, but we don't have similar level of knowledge for building performance?
Yeah, I kind of. I was talking to Paul just before we kind of came through, and I think what we were just talking about kind of maybe an issue with the industry that actually kind of we all need to up our game basically. We need to kind of improve our knowledge. We need to share that knowledge as well. And yeah, just the kind of point there is that kind of anyone who drives a kind of a diesel or kind of petrol car, we kind of you might sit in the pub and you talk about the miles per gallon of a car, but we've introduced this term energy use intensity, and actually if you speak to most people in the industry, they haven't got a kind of clue kind of what a building over there consumes in terms of its energy use. And again, it's just a whole new language that we need to kind of get our heads around. We need to educate ourselves. What's good practice? What's best practice? Just on the point of kind of training, we're finding, I think I mentioned earlier about this kind of real need to up our game in terms of building physics. I think it's been mentioned. Yeah, again, we've put kind of a whole kind of group of our kind of guys through training recently to do more detailed HVAC kind of modelling. To really kind of get to grips on that side. But the other thing that we're doing, and I think the industry needs to do generally, is to share our knowledge as well. So, kind of CPDs, I don't think we should be shying, kind of sharing kind of good practice, best practice. That's the only way to kind of really learn.
Great. You guys have mentioned soft landings. I think we're seeing it more and more. It's been around for a while. In my opinion, I don't think it's utilized as much as it could be. For any of you who've been involved in a project that has a proper soft landings overlay, would you mind elaborating on the success?
Yeah, I think Ben mentioned it earlier. I think my first experience was the Enterprise Centre up at the UEA, which had a full soft landing. So we were engaging right from the start, almost from when we got the brief, we were challenging the brief, regular workshops all the way through design, making sure that what we're delivering was still hitting the brief. The brief was still right because things change even through that design period. Making sure that when we're engaging with the estates team up at the university, they know what they're getting. If we're making any value engineering changes as you go through, making sure that they buy into those. So it's that constant sort of feedback and loop that comes around when you hand the building over, making sure that everyone who's in the building understands the sort of how it should operate. And there's a sort of education aspect to it. And as you go through it to sort of 2 years, 3 years post-occupancy, making sure that it's continued to operate as it should be. So it's not really, it's all good practice. It's all the things that everyone should be doing. And as people who are interested in buildings and designing buildings, it's what we should be doing. And if we can do it, and if we get a client that buys into it and understands it, then it gives a much better project at the end of it. And I think it's got confused probably over time. There was a government soft landings came in, that confused everybody. I think there's a big difference between government soft landings and what the traditional BISRA soft landings was. Government soft landings was much more about sort of handover and making the building right. That's too light a touch. You need to be involved earlier on, and you need to go beyond it as well. And then government tied up with BIM and everything else. Then you get to smart buildings, and actually, it's a fantastic process. It takes time, it takes effort, and you need a client that's going to buy into it, because it's not just the design team that they can't do it on their own. You need the sort of the building occupiers and the client team to be involved with it as well.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about it as approach is it puts the actual use of the building on the agenda from day one. So you're talking about how is this space actually going to be operated? What's the best kind of control system that's not going to confuse people when they walk in and someone comes in. So we had this from the same project that James was talking about, the Enterprise Centre. We had one part. Essentially, what you do is you bring together a kind of cross-party team, as it were. So one from the contractor, one from the control specialist, one from the M&E, one from the architect, one from the FM, and so on and so forth. And that team can change a bit, but ideally it stays the same all the way through. And so we'd have different themes in the workshop. One of the workshops was specifically around controls of the education spaces, because they were saying, well, no one understands the controls in any of our buildings, so that was our starting point. So the very first thing that was put in front of us was this kind of all bells and whistles controls panel, and we were just like, that's not going to work, because that's going to confuse people without the training. We couldn't afford it anyway. And we went through about 8 workshops and came up with, I think, probably the simplest controls possible. And actually everyone who uses that building says, oh, it's so refreshing to be able to walk into a building, see a panel, and actually understand that what I need to do. And that went through a number of different iterations. And I think if we didn't have that focus all the way through on those kind of elements, then we wouldn't have got to that point. We would have ended up with something that with maybe one level of refinement, which still wouldn't have worked for users.
it's really simple things. The estates guys said, if it's got LEDs on it, don't make them red and don't make them flash. Because if it's got a flashing red LED, someone's going to ring me up about it. So just simple things like that. So we had a blue and a green LED, and they didn't flash. And it just, a bit of a description underneath it that was quite wordy, but it had to be to tell people exactly what to do. But everyone understood what was going on.
Great. Okay, we're going to move on to the last question here. Matt, I'm going to send this one to you. So there's been a long perception that our industry is slow and resistant to change. So to move our industry from reactionary to visionary, how do we continue to instill confidence and, really importantly, draw investment from funders and attract the brightest minds to our industry?
Sure. So, yeah, just touch on kind of the investment side of things. We're finding that we're getting a lot of requests from the kind of the funders of projects. They want to know kind of basically what they're kind of getting kind of in terms of the how the building kind of performs against their own kind of ESG kind of requirements. Some kind of investors are better than others. We're finding that some kind of don't have basically any targets. We're finding that, but more kind of commonly now, we're finding kind of actually investment kind of companies are actually putting together their own ESG kind of requirements, and they're kind of asking kind of quite stretching questions about, you know, what is the energy use intensity of the building, how does it kind of perform in terms of its kind of decarbonisation over time, etc. So it does vary from kind of investor to investor, but I think kind of that seems to be where kind of the kind of the pressure is kind of coming from to retrofit from our perspective. One thing we're also kind of finding is that there's this kind of desire now, or kind of recognition that we can't do kind of deep retrofit overnight. Whilst there's an urgency, we need to kind of obviously kind of phase and stage kind of retrofit. So we're kind of working on a number of projects at the moment where we're developing net zero kind of plans, where basically the kind of the retrofit won't happen overnight. They may kind of start off with basic stuff around, for example, lighting replacement, but, you know, kind of taking the boiler out. If the boiler was only installed 5 years ago, there's perhaps a reluctance to kind of to whip it out and replace it with a heat pump. And there are other complexities as well about things like flow temperatures and et cetera, et cetera. But if you develop a net zero retrofit plan, at least you've kind of got that to kind of to go to. So every time you know, a tenant moves out, you've got an opportunity to retrofit. You can go back to the plan. It's kind of provides a consistent approach over time. So, and again, kind of that's kind of really being driven partly by investors as well. They want to know kind of what they're going to have in, you know, 5, 6, 7 years time.
Right. Definitely.
Yeah, and I think building on what Matt said, it's also not sometimes just not looking at one building, it's looking at a collection of buildings, particularly if you've got an organisation who've got several buildings and they need to do that retrofit plan across all the buildings. So it's actually kind of pulling those together and creating plans for each of those. And it may be that some of the big wins you can do across the whole estate, some of those buildings may not be possible to get all the way to zero carbon or deep retrofit, and you acknowledge that, and you actually look at some of the other stock that you've got and make kind of greater improvements in those buildings. So we're currently working with City of Edinburgh Council. We had 12 typology buildings to represent 300 buildings in their estate. So different types of buildings. So we had basically created Enefit-informed retrofit plans for each of those buildings. And what we were realising is that actually some of those buildings, to do a full Enefit, you know, was we had to sort of drop our passive house purism and say, look, this is just going to be cost prohibitive to do this. You're better to go to about 60, 70% after that, law of diminishing returns. But actually on another building, or with this building over here, you could probably go to even Enefit Plus because it's absolutely perfect for retrofit. So across the two buildings, you're going to get to where you need to be. And then if you do that across a larger sample, in this case 12 buildings represent 300 buildings, you know, you've got kind of greater scope to manoeuvre, you know, across all of those typologies.
Yeah, I think building on that is kind of trying to understand where to invest across the portfolio, is you can start to look at cost per tonne of carbon saved. So it tries to build a metric across all of those buildings to say, okay, if we spend £1,000 in this building, how much are we going to save against £1,000 here or here? And part of it is breaking any preconceptions that older buildings are going to be worse than newer buildings. That age doesn't actually have much of an indicator about how well a building is performing. Unfortunately, there's some brand new buildings that perform terribly, and there's some really old buildings that actually were designed really well with great thermal mass, and they perform really well. And so it's looking at the data and understanding it across that range of buildings as to where can we invest sensibly to get the best return, and where is a longer term project.
And Hugh, you had made an interesting point in some of the notes here about informing clients that decarbonization doesn't have to be seen as anti-growth.
Yeah, completely. I think, unfortunately, some of the government rhetoric is not kind of pitches growth against decarbonisation, and there was a consultation that ended last week that was very much, the questions were in that vein, and it's trying to understand that no, actually decarbonising can build growth. You're not just doing decarbonisation for the carbon saving sense, and there's no other things related to that. Hopefully, if you do it well, you're saving money, you're building a better internal environment potentially from those systems, and you're improving air quality for the local environment. So there's lots of knock-on effects that mean actually decarbonising is a great thing to do, and we should be looking at the opportunities that come from that and where you can build more from it, not focusing on the negatives and the things that are trying to get in the way.
And just going back to the concept of that our industry is slow and resistant to change. Peter, I'm going to bring this to you. Just to try to talk through the concept of the contractor being more of a collaborator.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we change in terms of how we're perceived and how we operate in not being so transactional with our clients. And we've got to really start to understand the design process a lot better than we do. We've got to get involved as early as we can, and then we've got to stay with the building afterwards. And that's really going to be crucial, as many have said on the panel. You know, it can't just be those 12 months defects. It's going to have to be much longer. We've started installing monitoring systems on a number of buildings we've finished that are simply standard new builds, all the way through to low carbon schools, to net zero potentially fire stations, where we're going to be with those buildings for a long time in terms of ensuring that they actually perform to the specifications that we set out to deliver at the beginning. And we can actually say they are low carbon or net zero or whatever the client has dictated. So I think it's going to be much more partnership, much more collaborative, and that's the way we'll stay in the game as a contractor going forward, with some really close ties to much more to the design side and also to our supply chain.
Right. And then we'll just wrap this question up. James, I'm going to pass this back to you. Could you maybe talk to us about how some clients might feel paralyzed by choice or confused?
I get quite confused, to be honest. I mean, it is. There are so many different things that are driving it. I think there's a lot of change going on anyway in terms of how businesses operate. I think we've sort of just about got people to understand that about energy efficiency, but then trying to tell a client that you can reduce your carbon, but actually your bills may go up because you're using electricity now, and with the fuel fluctuation, the cost of fuel changing, it's just really, really complicated. And I think we need things like the Entopia building that and Pete touched on. Really good case studies that sort of set out a clear path as to how you can get from where a client is to where they might want to be. I think that's really key. And I think, as Matt said, it's sort of we need to up our game in terms of communicating everything. It's complicated.
It is. Well, thank you everyone for joining us.